So I'd like to start off talking about one of our new soft white winter wheat varieties. And so we have, you may be familiar with Ambassador, and Jupiter is one of the most widely planted soft whites in the state. We've made crosses with these lines before they were even anywhere close to a farmer's field. We knew that these genetics were good and we were making crosses with these. And so we have Michigan 14W64 here that's a line derived from an Ambassador by Jupiter cross. And so we have very good yield potential for this line. You can get all the details in your handout here. But what we have is very good yield potential. This was the highest yielding soft white wheat in the state among experimental and commercial varieties. So we do have very good yield potential. I'd like to bring up one of my Mythbusters sessions here. There's been, for previous decades, well, scab is always a consistent problem in Michigan, right? There's a threat of... you can see it out here, exactly. It's been quite dry, but it's there. Scab is there always. All you need is the right conditions. There is variety resistance to scab, and two things. You don't have to trade scab resistance for grain yield. There are very high yielding varieties. The highest yielding lines in the state have scab resistance. Now, that brings me to W190 here. It's a Jupiter derivative, so it's originally a cross with a scab line of Ambassador, and then has two shots of Jupiter. It carries the resistance gene FHB1. This right here is the most scab-resistant line that we've tested in Michigan in the past 2 years. And it's a soft white winter wheat. So scab resistance is independent of background, and it's one of the highest yielding soft white winter wheats out there. So I will make the point that variety resistance on its own is more effective than a susceptible variety sprayed with a fungicide. That's what the data has shown. Years and years of extension fungicide trials have shown that moderately resistant varieties on their own, just the genetics, are more effective at controlling scab than chemical applications. The best possible synergy is a resistant variety treated with a T3 fungicide with the appropriate timing. That synergy is the best possible control of scab that you can get, genetics and management. That's another theme I'd like you to consider today, is the genetics integrated with your management program. Now, another Mythbusters, feel free to stretch your legs a little bit as we move down this way. W906, this is a newer line. This is just year one in commercial trials. And this is a soft white winter wheat. There's another myth I'd like to bust here, is that soft white winter wheat has a yield penalty compared to red wheat. And we now have a soft white wheat that is just as competitive with the most competitive soft reds in the state of Michigan. So this line is a few years out. Oh, I'd like to mention the W64 will be available for production for planting next year, next fall. So this will be available for planting next fall. W190 will be available at the fall of 2020 for planting. And this one is about a few more years out, 2021. So it takes a few years to derive the lines, get them tested, and then build up the foundation and certified seed for sales then. So W906 has very high yield potential, and you can see some of the characteristics they're very different between these varieties. One of which is maturity. Now, wheat varieties flower on different days, right? W64 flowers very early, and compared to W190 here, it flowers similar to Jupiter. So if you compare, let's say, Jupiter and Ambassador, two white wheats, one flowers early, and Ambassador's flowering early, Jupiter is about 2 days later. So there's something to consider. They do flower at different times. And so that's one way to mitigate risk, to spread your management. If you have, let's say, 3-4 inches of rain come down one day, have fun flowering, or not that much, let's say an inch, right? And you have a scab risk in your early planted variety, if that other variety is separated by flowering by 2 days, there's less risk for that other variety. So if you split your farm, you split your risk, right, with maturities. So pay careful attention to the flowering date. Another advantage to early flowering is that you get more grain fill. That 2 days earlier flowering buys 2 more days of grain fill. Wheat can get a lot done. These fields out here have been flowering for only a week and a half, and they're getting it done, right? So there's a lot of grain fill that can happen in 2 days. So that 2 days of earliness can buy you. We don't have much risk for frost. You know, in the, let's say, the Mississippi Delta or a tidewater region where you get potentially warm spells, you can't have early frost. We don't really have that much frost risk in Michigan. Anyway, so earliness is versus lateness is another trait to consider. Now for you red wheat growers, we do have an Ambassador by Shirley cross here R1140. It's a little bit taller than I'd like, but it's got very very thick canopy here, very high number of heads. It's a very high yielding line, fairly competitive. It's again, it's probably 3 years out from production. We are, it's under observation and yield testing this year, but it's an Ambassador by Shirley cross. So we freely cross red wheats by white wheats quite frequently. And very often you get the best combinations between lines that are very genetically different. Now this is a cross Ambassador by Shirley, genetically very, very different. Ambassador is related to a lot of the older Caledonia, Genesee type wheats. Some of you guys might know those names. They're very different from some of the soft red wheats that are developed in other breeding programs, right? And so you get sometimes you get a very good pop when you cross two very genetically different lines, meaning they probably have very different yield genes that you're bringing together in the superior progenies. Now,
make a cross like that, white and red.
Yes.
When you make a cross like that, do you know whether it's going to be white or red in the next generation then?
We don't. There are 3 different genes that control grain color. And so you get a segregation then. So they end up being red or white. Or if you have 3 red genes, they'll have a combination of 1, 2, or 3. And we won't know that until they're more and more fixed lines, inbred lines. Yeah. You can definitely tell in a line whether it's going to be all red or all white. Yep.
You don't get mixed up in the field then. It's going to be one or the other. Right?
No, yeah, definitely. You do. There is a very, very, very low. That's all you do. You do see some rogues occasionally that show up in here, and those are either from the combine or wheat has a very low level of all crossing. It's not like corn where pollen goes everywhere. Right. Wheat really keeps all the pollen locked up in those blooms like that. So you do see. That's why it's an inbred crop. That's why you can plant. You can bin run seed. You can bin run soybeans. I do not recommend bin running hybrid corn. Don't do it. So. Because it'll all segregate. Now, another important trait, those of you who are intensively managing your wheat should be considering plant architecture. Now, there's discussion of plant growth regulators. There's different chemistries that are affecting plant height, gibberellin inhibition. You can get very short plant type just via genetics, right? Now, a good example of that is Virginia 129 here. This is a line that we developed in cooperation with Virginia Tech. It is remarkably short. Contrast that with Hopewell, this older variety here, or 1140 to my right here. It's very short, and this is just based on genetics. It's a little bit later maturity, so if you're planning a program with varieties, it would be good. This would be a good complement on your farm to an early maturity variety. Flowers probably a half day to 1 day later than Jupiter as a reference point. But what we have here is a very short plant architecture that you could ramp up your nitrogen on. It can support. Now, a taller variety may need a plant growth regulator. May have, if it has long legs, it might go down under 150 pounds of N, 120, whatever your high-end management portfolio is. Whereas these shorter plant architectures can fight gravity a little bit better. They're less prone to lodging under intensive management. So, another point to consider to drive home the point about scab resistance. Now, and not being exclusive to market classes, Dynagrow 9242 is again one of the more scab-resistant lines in the state. It doesn't have the FHP1 gene, so it has some other genetic resistance, but it's very, very tolerant to scab. It's very high yielding as well. This is not a good representation of it. If you look at the highway that runs diagonal through Richville, there's a beautiful field of it. If you're headed that way, if you're headed back to Sandusky or something like that. But it's a very high-yielding, scab-resistant line. So there's a reason that Dynagrow Scout have moved a lot of this line in Michigan. So good scab resistance here. And fairly competitive. And we use it as a check in our breeding nurseries. It's a good reference point. Now, there are a suite of diseases present in Michigan here. You can actually see the scab out here. Occasionally, we get stripe rust, right? Those of you farming wheat in 2016 remember the stripe rust epidemic that moved through the state. I would not have known that Jupiter has strong resistance to stripe rust if we hadn't had that epidemic where we have the disease present in the field. But there are these other diseases that are not present. Just like scab, they're not present every year. But when they are, they can affect grain yield. So we need to be aware of them and selecting for them. And so we have those data available. We collect the data as it's available. Along with our collaborator on the variety trial, Dennis Pennington, we work together to do the work on the commercial variety trials and make that data available to you. So all these traits that I've talked about scab resistance, plant height, maturity, and so on are available to you all through the variety trial report that we try to get out to you as soon as possible after harvest, within 2 weeks after the combine shut off. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
What's the statistics of the test pile? Do you fungicide them? Is there 130 pounds of nitrogen? What's the core makeup of that pile?
That's a good point. He's asking to make what are the management practices on our variety trial plots. We do apply a 130 pounds of N and a T3 fungicide to all locations. Now, at one location this year, we had an issue. We try to do 2 locations where we have a split plot design. Where some plots are intensively managed, some have conventional management. That allows us to collect data on disease resistance, any diseases that are present with the absence of a fungicide. So we are evaluating varieties under intensive management. However, we do have conventional management data available as well, where it's just a standard weed control, 90 pounds of N, just urea in the spring. Good question. Any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
That falling balls, that's very scientific. I mean, they put a liquid in and grind it up, and if they're a half a drop or whatever over or under, it don't seem to me like it'd be very scientific for what they're doing.
Right. So so he's asking about the level of precision and scientific accuracy of the Hagberg falling number test that's done. There is some validity to it. Ask them to do replicates. If you have a load and you're not satisfied, if you're within 50 seconds, ask them to do replicates. And so you can get some those of you who have taken my genetics class, we covered standard deviation, right? Where you have a variance around the actual value. So some could be plus 25, some could be minus 25 seconds. So it requires some replication. But it really is, it's not the best standard measurement that we have, but it's the fastest. And so there have been conversations about standardization and finding new methods, not just at the elevator, like the falling number test, but something diagnostic in the field so that you are able to know in real time what the status of that load is before you deliver it, right? So you can actually make some decisions before waiting in line. So those aren't here yet, but I expect within the next 2 to 3 years, there has been federal funding for this work. You know, there's been hundreds of millions of dollars in losses in the Pacific Northwest to this. I mean, there are losses at the local level here, but you know, it's sort of there's been a lot more. There's millions, hundreds of millions of losses there. So anyway, there's a national focus on that. Yes, we'll have a better diagnostic in a few years. Definitely.
In the field, if there's soil type or characteristics that affect the falling numbers, I mean, if you would go across the field at variable, would you see different falling numbers in a clay knoll versus a sand knoll or a heavier soil?
It's possible. So the question is, are there any field factors, soil types that could influence the falling number? Now, the answer is yes, in so much as they influence the maturity of that variety. And so you'll know that depending on the variation in phosphorus or other micronutrients within a field or sand causing particular stresses, you can have those sandy areas flower a little bit earlier than a heavier soil where the plants are a little bit happier. They might flower as much as a half day, sometimes potentially a day. You can get a day variation within a field depending on the local soil climate there. So those that flower early versus late, even that day, they experience slightly different stresses in the case of temperature fluctuations. And of course, they might mature a little bit differently. So yeah, the short answer is yes, in that it could influence the phenology, the flowering date of the plants, the same genotype within the field. Yeah, it is possible. In terms of how to manage for that, uniformity and precision agriculture is kind of the answer to that. But again, that's the holy grail, so to speak. Any other questions before we head out? Okay, good. Now we'll have, if you're interested in seeing the variety performance trials this year, we have them just on Van Buren Road. It's the north-south road, just to our east over there. So please stop by at 2:30 today if you're interested in seeing some more genetics and talking a little bit more. Good to see you all today. Hope you enjoy the rest of the stop.